Mr. Robert Wilson, who is chairman of the Landon Patrons. Mr. Wilson. On your right, Professor Heinz Buhlman, professor of modern language and chairperson of the Kansas State University Faculty Senate. Angela Scanlon, Kansas State University Student Body President. Angela. We are very pleased this morning to have with us the Right Honorable Sir Harold Wilson, former Prime Minister of Great Britain. Prime Minister Wilson served 4 times as head of his country's government. His 4 terms as Prime Minister extended from 1964 to 1970 and from 1974 to 1976. During his years as Prime Minister, the British government began negotiation for entry into the European Common Market and wrestled with serious problems in Rhodesia and with the country's balance of payment. Under his direction, the British government took measures to strengthen and modernize the country's economy through increasing exports, countering inflation, and assisting regeneration of industry. Prime Minister Wilson's address this morning is most timely. He will discuss Western world economic crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honorable Sir Harold Wilson. Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. President, President Buhlman, Ms. Scanlon, Mr. Wilson, Dr. Richter, ladies and gentlemen, senior and junior members of this great institution. It is a privilege to be invited to take part in the Alfred M. Landon Lecture Series, the more so when I see the names of past speakers, many of whom were friends, President Ford, Richard Nixon, yes, there's been some controversy. Watergate apart, it's rather a big apart. Nevertheless, I found him a very great forward-looking president, particularly in international affairs. And Armstrong, a very welcome ambassador to the court of St. James. Milton Friedman, with whom I had a memorable exchange of civilities when lecturing in the University of Chicago. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know who that rather elderly-looking student, as I thought, who was heckling me might be, but I may not have known any economics, but I knew all about hecklers, and it was a memorable confrontation. Robert Kennedy, and, of course, Hubert Humphrey. If it weren't for the shirt that I bought yesterday that doesn't have proper holes in the sleeves, I would be doing as I have right through my tour of the United States, wearing the silver cufflinks he gave me marked Vice President of the United States. You've got to be president to have some gold ones. And, of course, Governor Landon, who rightly and properly delivered the first lecture I only just met, but I do recall as a student, as I then was at Oxford, his challenge to President Roosevelt in a historic contest, and appreciate his great record of service to this state and to his country and to our wider world alliance. I want to speak rather widely for a moment about the threat to our democracies and to set out the dangers that can be perceived to our democracies, North America and Western and Northern Europe, threats internal and external, political, military indeed, and certainly economic. It would be a grave error, I think, to simplify them entirely in terms of a persistent threat, some would say growing threat, military and economic, by an expansionist Moscow, though that is real, ever present, and demands that all of us in the West should exercise the maximum posture of readiness, flexibility, and clarity as a basis for an adequate and undeniable ability to respond. It is something of a paradox to recognize that the Soviet Union's present threatening attitude to the West might, not for the first time, be aggravated by Muscovite worries about Russia's fundamental and growing economic problems. It often has that effect. In this, as so often in Russian history, particularly in the reigns of the last 3 Tsars to wield power in St. Petersburg's Winter Palace, economic weakness has so often led to military adventurism. At the beginning of this century, a debilitating economy and the threat of subversion drove Tsar Nicholas to seek salvation in what proved to be a disastrous attack on the Japanese. The problem for Moscow is aggravated by the failure of what not long ago they regarded as their most formidable asset, an almost unlimited supply of oil, adequate to meet the import needs of the Western democracies. They had a lot of oil. When I negotiated with them as a trade minister in the late 1940s, they were pressing that oil upon us. But now, of course, the European democracies, particularly Britain with our finds in the North Sea, European and American democracies are virtually awash with surplus oil and suffocating with volatile gaseous supplies. Britain is a net exporter both of the fluid and of North Sea volatile gas and is currently cutting production. I have tried to study these matters. You will all know that on the authority of the second book of Genesis, the Lord created the earth and the heavens and the seas. And by implication, he must have also put there the treasures beneath the seas. It's a very long time ago. I was moderately pleased that that oil in the North Sea was discovered during my own period as Prime Minister. So I can't claim any of the credit for having put it there. Today we have the spectacle of the Soviet Union, a once victorious military power, bogged down in the wastes of Afghanistan by a Crimean-type expansionist adventure which Peter the Great would have scorned, and increasingly bogged down in Poland too, where we all pay tribute to the bravery and gallantry of some of Poland's leaders. 34 years ago, Prime Minister Clement Attlee appointed me to his cabinet in the job which for 2 centuries has been known as President of the Board of Trade. It doesn't mean what it means in the United States, an important position in private industry, but it is really the Minister for Trade and Industry. There used to be, in fact, the Board of Trade, I made very thorough research, just has never met. There is a board, it has never met. The Archbishop of Canterbury is a member of it, amongst others. And there used to be a little poem which said, the president himself is grossly overpaid. There never was a board, now there isn't any trade. It's much quoted in my own time, but it goes back earlier. But we were desperate for grain, for feeding stuffs, to avoid a mass slaughter of our livestock. And I was sent by Attlee to negotiate with Stalin's government, in particular with Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan, a wily Armenian trader, then trade minister and later president of the Soviet Union. And I remember he used to say, we had to work very long hours, or late hours, and he sometimes used to say, I don't know, he said, in Russian it was translated, I don't know when you have an Armenian dealing with a Yorkshireman what chance is there of an agreement. Stalin had the bad habit of beginning work at around 4 p.m., not something I would commend to the distinguished academic heads here, and going through the night till 5 a.m. And his ministers had to work the same hours in case they were sent for, no idle threat. And so had the unfortunate Western trade ministers who were negotiating with his ministers. In the event, on my 3rd visit, I did reach an agreement at 6 o'clock on a bitterly cold Moscow December morning, and our livestock herds were reprieved. They tried to postpone a settlement. The reason was we were negotiating for wheat and for coarse grains for our feedstuffs, and we were arguing about prices, And just when I was beginning the last stage of the negotiations, I got a telegram to say we had negotiated a big wheat agreement with Australia. So I naturally produced this, and I said, I don't want your expletive deleted wheat. It did translate, I think. I don't want your wheat. I want your coarse grains. And McCoy looked almost pathetic and said, I'm delighted. He said, we are short of wheat. We're rationing bread. We have some, yes, feeding stuffs. That is fine. And we were negotiating on the price. A real old haggle. It is, as I say, an Armenian. But the Russians always haggle. That's why you don't accept what they say first time round. And I was authorized to go to $123 a ton. We did it all in American dollars. And so I said, well, I'm going to offer 108. And he said that wasn't enough. And then he'd a very nasty man there. I can't remember his name, fortunately. It might have been Skripov. I don't remember. He was an MVD, NKVD product, and he'll fry in hell someday. I mean, no doubt about that. But he was also very rude. And he said, well, what price are you? No, Mikoyan first asked me what price we were paying the Australians. I said, you ask Mr. Skripov, he knows everything, don't you? I said. He didn't dare say he didn't. I was gambling on the fact that he didn't, and he didn't. And he said, well, but the Australians are just a colony of yours. And I try and tell that to a few Australian prime ministers I've known. And they did everything to postpone a decision that night. I kept saying, no, I'm going back. I'd whistle my aircraft up, a very old-fashioned thing from London, and I had the engineers of that aircraft going and revving up the engines. It's all pure pantomime, but dealing with the Russians, you've got to be able to use pantomime as much as they do. And then they played their ace of trumps. Mikoyan said, I have very, very good news for you. He said, Generalissimo Stalin has invited you to dinner tomorrow evening. And obviously you could not possibly refuse that. Well, couldn't I? I had an ace, of even better ace. Clement Attlee, our Prime Minister, had organized a dinner for younger members of the Cabinet and younger ministers outside the Cabinet with their wives to meet the newly engaged Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, now Duke of Edinburgh, and Her Royal Highness, the then Princess Elizabeth. And he wanted the younger ministers to meet with these young people. And when I mentioned that, a country which was still run by a government just beginning to revere the memory once again of Peter the Great, they withdrew in the face of a royal engagement party. But my warning is that an aging Soviet government, and 75 is par for the course over there at the present time, bogged down by economic crisis and the Afghanistan adventure, can be not only prickly, but as so often in history can turn to truculence and threats against all of us to divert public opinion, which is an increasingly important factor in the Soviet Union now, from its economic record. The Soviet economy today is weaker than at any time in the past half-century. But this, I fear, is not in any way a guarantee of pacific intentions. More probably the reverse. A Bolshevist czar, and they have all the powers of a czar, is just as likely as a Romanov czar to seek a diversion from internal grumbling and criticism and subversion in threats and trouble-mongering. A stagnant economy has as its mirror image a threatening military posture, even though one of the prime reasons for economic weakness is Moscow's heavy investment in the nuclear weapons of terror. There can be no doubt that this massive distortion of the economy for the purpose of banging the drum in threats to the free world lies at the heart of her economic weakness. A generation ago, the Kremlin was threatening to dominate Europe by massive shipments of oil and grain. The Western world faced a shortage of oil. Soviet leaders told me in Moscow at that time that they could meet all the import requirements of France and other European countries But today oil is pouring out of the world's ears. OPEC and Western consumers also, of course, dance to any tune Sheikh Yamani cares to regale them with, and he can always cut the price when he wants to, and nobody wants the Russian oil. Although the rate of agricultural production in the Soviet Union has grown faster than its domestic population over the past 30 years, although the servile Soviet press has been publishing front page and exaggerated reports about this year's harvest, don't ever believe those figures, there has been little or no reporting of the massive Soviet imports of grain from the United States, Canada, and the Argentine. Still less the fact that the Soviet Union is today the largest importer of grain in the world, buying 25 to 30 million tons each year, possibly more this year, from American countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe. All this, even though the USSR does in fact produce more than twice as much wheat as the United States. And its production of all grains, wheat, rye, rice, millet, buckwheat, for human consumption is higher than that of America, Canada, and Australia put together. The reason for this has been a very good study by Roy Medvedev, the dissident Soviet sociologist, and his biologist brother Jaresh, now living in London. And as they point out, the reason for this is, and there's some very first-class analysis which I won't trouble you with, that the consumption of bread and other cereals is higher in the Soviet Union than anywhere else in the world. But it is the average meat production of 132 pounds per person, much higher than in most countries, that creates the serious problems because of the massive amounts of grain required for that livestock. Their consumption of meat may be 40% below the American level, but it is growing, and it is produced at a very heavy cost in terms of the consumption of grain. Now, the Kremlin, through the Soviet Communist Party, has warned its local contact men, paragons in the art of arm twisting, I don't need to tell you, that there must be strict economy in food conservation in the months ahead. Last year, the grain harvest was 189 millions. Most Western experts think it's going to be about that 185 million tons this year, let's say. The Moscow is now putting out that it's going to be 200 millions. It'll be interesting to see if it is. And there is a suspicion in the West, in the wheat markets of the West, that these published Soviet overestimates were designed to talk down world wheat prices in case they have to buy a lot more. But there are reports of grain kernels shriveled by excessive heat in the heartlands of the southern Urals and northern Kazakhstan. But it's not only wheat. Coal, you can't blame that on the weather. Господин Boris Bratchenko, the coal industry minister, has written in Socialist Tekskaya that productivity was now low because of poor morale among miners, inadequate mechanization, he's calling, and incomplete infrastructure, shortage of equipment and spare parts, and he's calling for a shift to open cast mining, what of course in the United States is called strip mining. So what with wheat, feeding stuffs, coal, so much for the planned economy. But I repeat the message, my friends, when the bear is sick, watch out for his claws, not to mention his hug. All this and China too, where the Russians, of course, are faced by that massive land frontier. In the long period when my party was in opposition, up to 1964, I was invited to go to Geneva, where there was a big conference on, and I met Zhou Enlai, or Zhou Enlai as he's spelt, there, and he invited me to go to China, where I had a 7-hour audience with him, which was indeed fascinating, and I published reports of it in the British and American newspapers. At that time, China was still, nominally at least, firmly linked with the Soviet Union, and there was no suggestion in public, at any rate, that there was any break coming. It just happened, I didn't cause the break, I hasten to add. It just happened that I did stumble by accident on one of the first signs of the break. If you go to China, you've got to be sponsored by somebody. Well, I was the opposition spokesman on finance, what we used to call shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I was sponsored by the Bank of China. And they gave me a dinner party, the bankers, the directors of the Bank of China. I'd never heard of this body before. And the chairman of it, fortunately, was a chap called Dr. spelt C-H-I, it's pronounced G, Dr. G, who happened to hold a PhD degree from the London School of Economics, and therefore spoke perfect English, or anyway, LSE English. But we had this party, and then I said, look, I want to put a question to you. It was a very uproarious party. I was due to fly back the next day. I said, I want to put this question to you that I don't understand. So when I go to Moscow, this was before they had those special price shops for tourists, I said, when I go to Moscow and I want to buy something to take back for my wife or small boys, I can't find anything that I can possibly afford at the prevailing rate of exchange on which my notes have been issued. Now, I said, I was walking through your street, and I went to a shop. It wasn't a tourist shop or anything. It was a perfectly ordinary shop, and I bought a very pretty dress for my wife at the same sort of price I would think it would cost in England. Now, if the rate of exchange is correct between England and China, if it's all to blazes between England and the Soviet Union, what about, and I drew a triangle in the air, what about the third line of the triangle? And these Chinese bankers started to roar with laughter and nearly fall off their chairs and point at me and say in Chinese something that sort of said, what a one he is, isn't he funny? You know, and this is terrible. And I didn't know what they were talking about. And then Dr. G turned to me and said, you know what they're saying? I said, no, what are they saying? He said, they're saying, he's got onto it. A break between the two major communist powers was inevitable. It happened soon afterwards, so I'm not, of course, claiming credit for it with my visit, still less with my excellent dinner. Now, the reason I've gone on at this length about the communist world, or at any rate the two principal communist countries, is this. As I've said, so far from anyone becoming complacent because of Soviet economic weakness, I believe that this very weakness brings its dangers because they are likely to seek to turn their subject people's minds to the external scene in order to limit trouble at home. There are anxieties, we have anxieties now, that the West German bulwark against the East is less dependable than in recent years. Their economy, after very many years of high success, is vulnerable. The magic isn't working anymore. Helmut Schmidt, with whom I had dealings when I was an opposition leader at Socialist International meetings in Berlin and elsewhere, and of course particularly when I was at Downing Street. Helmut Schmidt, terrible warrior. He worried even when he was riding high in economic terms, the most successful country perhaps in the world. But he has reason to worry now. Even his ever-loyal Hamburg, as much part of his life as, shall we say, California is to President Reagan. Hamburg has thrown out his party from civic control. And the last election, nationwide, produced a far from welcome change for him. It was not so much that he lost a few seats to the other parties. It was that those who were elected contained a bothersome proportion of left-wing cowboys and trained troublemakers who were causing him trouble all the time and endangering the alliance with his religious coalition partners. Now, if we turn now to the broader international economic scene, the Western world economies are, of course, dominated by oil. I've referred to our own good fortune here. The first little sliver of oil, if that's the right word, was found in 1966. The Danish Prime Minister was visiting us, Jens Otto Krag, and the news came through in dinner, and we'd only found about an egg cup full of oil, but we drank to its success. Not in oil, I say. Even so, every household in Western importing countries, every industrial establishment using oil the world over is now at the mercy of the OPEC kings and chieftains. Sheikh Yamani, with whom I had most friendly dealings in my last two premierships after 1976, has cracked down, as he alone is in a position to do, on any runaway in oil prices. But that is not to say that prices haven't risen prodigiously. They have. In fact, between 12.5 and 15 times the average price of, say, 10 years ago. Kuwait oil, 21% of the then price. Saudi Arabia, 1,304%. Venezuela, 1,259%. That is up to the figures up to last month. But the Russians' hope, nevertheless, the Russians' hope of a few years ago of dominating Europe's economy by supplying or withholding Western Europe's oil has been over-trumped. The United States, of course, may yet, and relatively quickly, become less dependent on oil imports from the troubled areas of the world. And recalling how dependent we all were on Iranian oil not very many years ago, all the friends of America anxiously and expectantly watch the prospects of what we hope will be a steady and growing supply from the Yukon to meet your own needs. Now I turn to the British economy. Let us take Britain. We're a small island, as you know, a small workforce by your standards. Some of our major industries are too fragmented as compared with yours. I'm not talking here about genuinely small firms. I'll come to that in a moment, I hope. The classic case, I think, of a completely declining and inefficient industry was the coal industry, which the first post-war Labour government nationalised. I was at that time a junior minister on housing until I became Trade and Industry Minister. But in fact, they followed exactly the plan for nationalisation which I had prepared. I wrote it in 5 weeks at Oxford. We had a rule in those days. We had a lot of temporary civil servants, not permanent ones. Permanent ones cannot stand for Parliament, and the rule still applied. The temporary ones, temporary civil servants had to resign. I had when I was adopted for a parliamentary seat. I remember I ran into Ernie Bevin the next weekend. Ernie, tremendous figure, almost square he was. And he had one favourite phrase. He said, "I won't have it." And if Ernie wasn't having it, it wasn't had. And Ernie, on this occasion, said, "Why didn't you come and tell me?" He said, "I'd tell the cabinet to make a rule that anyone who does get a seat can continue in the civil service." Well, it was too late. And on the whole, I was quite glad because I had a lot of things to attend to, including, of course, my constituency. But I do remember, in earlier days, my first visit to Washington. I was secretary, joint secretary, with a distinguished American, later an ambassador, later still head of university, Samuel Berger. And Sam Berger was joint secretary with me of a committee, Anglo-American committee, reporting to the combined chiefs of staff. We were concerned with stocks of everything for the Second Front, and above all, stocks of coal all around Britain, building up enormous stocks to release ships for landing craft for the invasion of the continent. I must say, although I was privy to these deep secrets, I knew when the invasion was because we were called in, postponed for a day, bad weather. Then Ike said, "Let's go." And it all happened. But they took me for a ride as well, because they said to me, why do you think you had to stock up all these areas with coal and all the rest of it? I said, presumably to release ships for the Second Front, for the attack on Normandy, which is now going on. He said, "Aye, and where do you think those ships are?" I said, "Probably on the third trip now between Normandy and the south coast of Britain." He said, "You're quite wrong." He said, "They're in Dover Harbour, a lot of them." He said, "And they've got steam up," and I'm happy to say, he said, that a German spy plane has flown over, and we carefully didn't shoot it down. And it's gone back with photographs of all those 50 ships with the steam up. He said that, of course, and I then realized these ships were a decoy to make the German High Command think that the attack in Normandy was only a feint to draw their troops, and that we were going to cross the narrow straits between Dover and Calais and cut them off at the back. And they kept a lot of troops there, though unfortunately, as we all recall, well, the older ones here recall, when we did reach that area, we went through hell because of the troops that they had got, and there was a big hold-up in our advance. Now, let us look for a moment at the economic facts. So far as Britain is concerned, I saw estimates by all the international departments, the British press. I put them all together and divided by the number of them. Slightly crude statistical exercise. And I found their average earlier this year. They said the unemployment will come to 2.74 million in Britain this year. In fact, it is now very close on 3 million. They underestimated. And the margin of error could easily take us above 3 million when the next figures are published. We're very, very close to it. And these are the highest figures of unemployment since the Depression years of the early 1930s. I never attack the leader of the government in Britain when I'm out of Britain, but to quote Mrs. Thatcher's own arguments, she hopes by this to reduce inflation. We have a statistically bogus way of measuring inflation in Britain, taking this month against the same month next year, which might have been kinky, of course, and I'd prefer a running 5 months running average, but the statisticians here will have something better than that, I'm sure. And the figures are rising higher, as I say, to close on 3 million. But the worst problem in human terms, and this really is something you've got to watch very, very carefully in your great country, the worst problem in human and economic terms is the army of juvenile unemployed. In my depressed area of Liverpool, distressed as it always been, never a factory town, we scheduled as a development area, build some great factories, reduce unemployment. But now, boys and girls who left school in my constituency a year last July, have still not got jobs, and there's nothing worse or more demoralizing. Some of our big firms, like Pilkington's, the great glassworks, are offering them jobs, training jobs that really are not economic to Pilkington's out of the sheer kindness of their heart. And also they're helping any small firms who want to set up business there, small businesses, which is an extremely valuable thing for them to do. Let me just tell you one thing about Pilkington's. Part of it's in my constituency. And one of their cousins, the cousins of the head of the firm, is Sir Alistair Pilkington, who's a great scientist. And we produce most of the world's glass there, or in subsidiary companies overseas. And he was helping his wife with the washing up one night. Yes, they do that in our country. I've no doubt it happens here too. But not, I understand, in Iran. But however, he was helping her with the washing up, and the soap suds from the detergent suds, he saw them floating on the top of the washing up water, and he had an idea. And that produced the revolution, technological revolution, known as float glass. He has enormous water tanks, far bigger than this hall. And the molten glass flows in over the liquid. It's not quite water, it's a mixture of a lot of things. And it floats off, and then it's allowed to cool and to solidify, and that produces the finest and flattest glass in the world. Well, I thought I'd just mention that because it has provided work for a few of my constituencies. But you know, I've mentioned the problems of Her Majesty's present government under Mrs. Thatcher. They did, I think, take over with a lot going for them. Economically, I mean, obviously, politically as well. This was in sharp contrast to the situation in '74 when I was returned to power after I'd very carelessly lost the 1970 election. It was an unhappy election, very, very hot, and people felt upset and miserable. And they thought the public opinion polls showed an enormous swing to us. We were going to walk it, and people didn't bother to vote, so Mr. Heath won. And at the end of that period, when we took over, I had a majority of 2 in a house of 600 and odd. It was very dodgy, with 1 or 2 of my chaps always ready to defect or default, or whatever, if I didn't do all that the separate little groups wanted me to do, and I didn't. But it's the only election to be held, the only government to be formed under a state of national emergency proclaimed by the Queen, apart from wartime, of course. and there was a state of national emergency, it was illegal for any factory to work more than 3 days a week, with very heavy penalties if they did, and there were all kinds of other things. There was a big miners' strike on. Well, as I said, I'd known the miners. When I came in, we settled with the miners very cheaply indeed on the first day we came in. The second day I took off the national state of emergency, and the third day, by that time, I was having a terrible row with some of the departments, because I had always taken the line I would not allow arms to be shipped to South Africa. I'd had an attack on me from some of my own colleagues, senior colleagues. There was a little breakaway movement, but I got onto it and called the cabinet early Monday morning when they didn't expect it, and got my own way that there'd be no arms for South Africa. Mr. Heath, I'm sorry to say, was shipping arms to South Africa, helicopter for reducing native areas and all that kind of thing. And I just happened to mention, when I came in to the cabinet secretary, I just said, I want the Home Office. I suppose they'll have to continue to look after satellites and cable and broadcasting. They're the wrong people, the Home Office, may I mention in passing. The Home Office, a very great institution with the present Deputy Prime Minister is head of it. They're terribly good at prison reform and conditions in prisons and trying to control any excesses of sex in the royal parks and all that kind of thing. They're very good at that, but they have no economic perception at all, and I made the mistake of leaving them with the satellite revolution. I said, by the way, it is also the policy of the new government that we will not allow arms for South Africa. Didn't realize how quickly it was going to respond. The next day, dock workers were being brought in, and right through the weekend they worked, double time, a time and a half on Saturday, double time on Sunday, payments, for unloading the ships, and that Mr. Heath had commissioned to take arms to South Africa. And with all the arguments going on now, and I'm glad to see Mr. Heath converted to the proposition there should be no arms to South Africa, I'm delighted to feel that we were so successful at that time. Well, but unfortunately, as I've said, we inherited at the same time a very serious financial deficit on our balance of payments. Now, the economic historians here will know that we have collected our export and import figures and trade balance ever since, yes, you've guessed it right, 1822. We've had all those figures, and they've varied, of course, day to day, year to year, cycle to cycle. In 1970, when we left office, we had a surplus of 1,000 million pounds on our trade and payments. In 1970 money, that was. It's worth more now. When we returned in the middle of this worst world economic crisis, certainly in peacetime, that surplus of 1,000 million pounds had given way to a deficit on our balance of payments of 4,000 million pounds. And we were at the height of the oil crisis, and as I say, we took over in this state of national emergency, but at the end of the week, we'd ended it, as I've said. The miners were back to work, and Britain was slowly beginning to pick up. It was a terrible inheritance. Now, I'd like to say one thing about our political situation in Britain, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about it, even in Britain, but certainly I found in the United States, in the United States press. We have, in Britain, no communist problem. I could almost say we've no communists now, but we have, I think they claim, 35,000 members in a country with a 50 million population. Most of them are aging citizens, not active anymore, communing with the past, those memories of theirs of the great days of Stalin, and some of them even Lenin, reading each day, or at any rate buying and perhaps not reading the Morning Star. That's an alias under which the old Daily Worker is now being published, and of course the title was taken from one of the Chartist newspapers early in the last century. And they're living on their memories of the 1920s and 30s and the defeat of the Nazis by the Soviet army of a third of a century ago. Now, so virtually we've no communist problems, just a few hanging around in some of the factories. But we have a much bigger problem. Our problem is not the communists, it is the Trotskyists or Trotskyites. I don't mind which they're called. Not least in our factories, as well as in our local government and their attempts to take over national government. And above all, of course, they have been active, particularly in the last year, in this attempt of theirs, which cannot yet be written off as a failure, of infiltrating the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party, which God preserve, of course, and he's having to work hard at the moment, but the Labour Party, which was founded at the turn of the century, it used to be regarded as the party that came in after long periods of conservative rule and then failed and went out again. I used to call it, to claim that it was the natural party of government in Britain. And it was for a time. We won 4 general elections out of 5. And I've always described the Labour Party as like an old-fashioned stagecoach. You've got to keep it rattling along at such a pace, such excitement, that everybody inside it are either so exhilarated, or at least so seasick, that they don't cause you any trouble. And for most of my period, I was successful in doing that. The trouble occurs when it stops at the crossroads and they start to argue, shall we go straight on? Shall we turn left? Shall we turn right? Shall we double back on our tracks? All pointing at the signposts and trying to read the maps. They've all got different maps. And this, I think, is certainly what is happening in the Labour Party today. I've no doubt if there were any questions, I would be asked about a member of my cabinet for a short time, Mr. Ben, who I've already mentioned. He was a very good Postmaster General, I've said. He was a good Minister of Technology, but he is now completely in the hands of an organization of shop stewards. He believes in shop stewards, not the trade union leaders, not the industrial leader or the regional leader. And that is now a very serious problem for us. And he has his followers, though I was glad to receive, since I came into this building today, a report on the voting for the National Executive at the Labour Party conference, which I have carefully not been able to attend. And there has been a massive swing to the reasonable people, with a majority now, I think, on the National Executive, which I couldn't have forecast, and the ousting of some of the leading figures on the left. Well, as I say, I think that is very good news indeed. Though the vote for the treasurer of the party, which is, for the deputy leader of the party, which is always a big sign of what's going on, was won, in fact, by Mr. Dennis Healy, sober-sided figure, educated in the United States, or re-educated in the United States. And he, I think, got 50.17% against Mr. Ben's 49.83, something like that. It's a very, very narrow thing. When I said, I must, having used that phrase, explaining. Dennis was a communist when he was 21. Now, a lot of people were in our country. My only worry about anybody who has been a communist is not that they're going to remain a communist. I've mentioned that they don't. But they have learnt communist methods of logic and philosophy, which are very, very strict. You press the letter A and it goes right through automatically as a mental process to what we call Z and you call Z. And every communist I've ever met is like that. Now, Dennis was a reformed character. He saw the light. He was converted when he spent 2 years working with the Rand Corporation in the United States, who are as good at washing brains as any organization I've ever met, and they perform very, very great services in decommunizing people. But he is very certain now that everything, that's why I think we had about 17 budgets when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Nevertheless, I'm delighted I was one of his nominators, together with another ex-Prime Ministerial colleague, Mr. Callaghan, and I'm glad he's won it, and it could lead to a very, very much more hopeful situation in the United Kingdom. Now, before I finish, let me just go for a moment to wider Europe. before I finish with a few words more about Britain. There are these estimates now that youth unemployment this year will be over 20%, and that means 15 million people out of a job in the principal West European countries. France is now promising a marked real increase in defense spending, as indeed is another very important country, I understand, accompanied by bigger public sector borrowing in France and job creation programs. And of course there is a very serious possibility this will come unstuck. Now, to conclude, I'd just like to say something about our experience in Britain in the relations between government and industry, and my own experiences and some of the attitudes that we took, and what is now happening in Britain, which has surprised many people, myself most of all. Something that was happening I didn't realize. I was Prime Minister and nobody knew, not a member of Parliament seemed to know anything about it. There was nothing in Hansard. The press didn't know anything about it, and we've got this great revolution. Let me start this off by referring to research and development, R&D. In pre-war days, R&D in Britain was at a low ebb. We were being left far behind by your country. We were still living on the intellectual capital of the past. Indeed, eminent British economic historians tend to point to the year 1873, which was the year of the great cyclical downturn, as also being the year when we began to lose out to our overseas competitors in a secular sense, in a permanent decline, not just a trade cycle decline. When I was president of the Board of Trade, as I say, Trade and Industry Minister in 1947, I was obviously anxious as a young lad to do whatever was possible to reverse this trend, and I introduced legislation which was bitterly fought by our opponents in Parliament to set up a fund, a very small fund, very little money indeed, a few thousand, perhaps £50,000, or something like that. And it was to be staffed, directed by industrialists, engineers, scientists, and the odd economist. You can always find an odd economist, with power on their own initiative to lend money for R&D, research and development, especially the D for development. I expected to lose the whole capital, and I didn't mind. But in fact, we made a large profit, huge profit for the taxpayer, and the research, because the research and development was so successful, and we were able to sell the patent rights to private industry. And if I could just take you back for a moment to an experience which foreshadowed this. When the war came, I registered for military service and wondered where I might be sent. I was told to go back to college till my age group came up. I was then, of course, diverted to the Cabinet Secretariat, then under Neville Chamberlain and later under Churchill. But because of the austerity of the times, the senior members of the college, the dons, the tutors, fellows, no longer had breakfast served to them in their rooms. We all had a common breakfast together in the common room. We could see the privations of war were striking Britain already. And I was rather surprised that our medical research tutor, later the Regius Professor of Medicine, proposed and carried that a research assistant working for him should become a member of the dining club. I thought, well, Sir William Beveridge, the great economist with whom I was working, the master of the college, we don't bring our research assistants. What's all this about? And he could hardly speak a word of English. And then one morning we were all having breakfast and we opened our copies of the Times and found he'd been given the Nobel Prize for Medicine. He had, in fact, his name was Ernst Chain, or Kine, and he, together with Professors Florian Fleming, had discovered and produced penicillin, which has, of course, revolutionized medical health. And so when I set up this Research Development Corporation after the war, he came to approach me, and I referred him to the National Research Development Corporation, and they were involved in the new discovery, cephalosporin. So our little NRDC, so far from taking money from the taxpayer, as was expected, made a profit running into hundreds of millions for the public purse, money coming into the exchequer. And I understand now, the chairman of NRDC, whom I appointed, recently retired, says that they're going to make hundreds of millions more profit in the next few years, again mainly in the United States, because of a great and successful discovery in the field of artificial fertilizer, so I advise you to look out for that. Now, this is one reason why I've always rejected the arid philosophy of many in my party, indeed, and many on the other side of the House, who fight to the death for the concepts of private enterprise versus public enterprise, as though you could always easily draw the line between them. I've always believed in a partnership between the private and the public sector. And in the main, it's been my policy to try to limit the sphere of public help, participation, subsidies, to the industries that fall either into the category of infant prodigies, I just referred to one or two, or into the category of temporarily wounded heroes. During my last premiership, I happened to be in Burnley, in Lancashire, on the way to Balmoral, where the Prime Minister goes every year for 2 or 3 days, and has a wonderful time. And you have your weekly audience of the Queen up in Balmoral. And I was on my way up there, and a message came through from Downing Street to say that a great electrical engineering firm in Scotland called Ferrantis had run into financial difficulties. They were superb. They export all over the world. Many of your electrical engineering people will know about them. But they'd run into financial difficulties and were having to close down. So I said, over my dead body, or words to that effect. And I put NRDC and, no, I put another financial organization that we controlled onto them. And they gave them enough money to sort themselves out and brought in a little sort of 1 or 2 company doctors to look at them and so on. And I was happy after leaving, and it was everything was all right. They were very sophisticated. They were going almost beyond the limits of science and technology, and they succeeded. And I was delighted 2 or 3 years ago, long after leaving Number 10, to find that they had now relaunched themselves on the stock exchange, and the chairman of the stock exchange, I think it was, said that their launch of their capital provided quite a sexy package for the City of London. So that is the kind of area where I think you should intervene. We were right, may I say, to nationalize coal and, in our small island, railways. There was much greater argument about steel. My reason for supporting steel nationalization was because it was monopolistic. I didn't mind that so much. A good, efficient monopoly, though it's easy to check it, it's hard to check its efficiency if it's the only one around. But that can be one thing. But this was a cartel. It was a price-fixing organization, feather-bedding the less efficient. So steel was nationalized during my first 2 premierships in 1964-66 and 66-70. Then, as I've mentioned, I lost the 1970 election. Mr. Edward Heath denationalized steel. He didn't touch coal, of course, and did very little to the railways. And then suddenly he produced the biggest nationalization program of all, Rolls-Royce engines. They were in financial difficulties. They were vital to our aircraft industry. Many of you have flown, perhaps without knowing it, with the help of Rolls-Royce engines. And Mr. Heath, the great, we used to call him the great dinosaur, but others would say the great, Disraeli would have called him the rising hope of the Conservative Party, and he nationalized Rolls-Royce engines, the biggest nationalization project perhaps in the last 25 years. In 1974, our election manifesto nominated only 2 industries for nationalization, shipbuilding and aircraft. I don't think there was controversy. I don't think there need have been. Both were entirely dependent on state subsidies as arms industries, and indeed, as I say, we had also backed Ferrantis, and that was the whole of our nationalization program. And all those arguments about nationalization, denationalization, renationalization, still going on assiduously in our press, in our political meetings, in the Labour Party and everywhere else. They've proceeded throughout my 35 years in Parliament, and now I believe they are entirely sterile. Even Mrs. Thatcher, whom you could not regard as a raging socialist in any form, who is more passionate in her belief in free enterprise than anyone I know, including, as I've mentioned, Milton Friedman. They have not sought to denationalize the coal industry or the steel industry. Indeed, she's been subsidizing them both to an enormous extent. And while she's making some changes in the North Sea Oil Organization, it is still nationalized to a considerable degree. So, in fact, these old-fashioned doctrinaire arguments, on both sides doctrinaire, have become increasingly stale, and I'll conclude by telling you why. There's an alternative word to nationalize, which is a harsh word, isn't it? All those consonants. It's a nice word, socialize. To some people, the words mean the same. But nationalization, as I have said, has only usually meant the substitution of bureaucrats, be they ministers, or civil servants, or people appointed, for almost equally bureaucratic, monopolistic tycoons in so-called private industry. That's the change it's made. But in fact, without anybody realizing it, British industry has been very largely socialized in the last 3 or 4 years without anyone noticing it. Not as much, may I say, as American industry has, and most people haven't noticed that either. If you test the word socializing by asking the question of any industry, who owns it? Who are the shareholders? In terms of ownership as opposed to actual executive direction, all the major private industries in Britain are now socialized, and this is true of the United States, because they are owned by the pension funds which properly belong to the workers. Now, in my country, no one had ever heard of the pension funds or of their growth. As Prime Minister, I never heard about it. It wasn't in a single newspaper. And I checked after I began to hear about it, when I was conducting this inquiry into the financial institutions of the City of London. We've had 20 of those inquiries since the days of Walpole, the first Prime Minister, and I'm old enough to remember, as a young Oxford student and then a front bench spokesman, the first 2. And this is the third, to go into the whole question of the financial institutions and their relevance to industry and so on. And I looked up Hansard for my period as Prime Minister, 74-76, to see how much pension funds had been mentioned in Parliament. And the Hansard Index is usually reliable. And over the whole period, volume after volume, only 4 questions were put in that whole period. 3 of them were about benefits. How much am I going to get out of the new scheme, sort of question, or my constituents, of course. And the 4th one was a meaningless written question that nobody could understand, so the minister concerned gave an equally meaningless written answer. He couldn't be pursued with supplementaries because it was written and published that way. And then when I was doing this inquiry into the city with a very top-level team, Lord Mayor of London, Chairman of Unilever, Deputy Chairman of General Electric, top trade unionists and so on, we were really set up because Jim Callaghan was worried about a Labour Party conference. They were going to pass a resolution, which they did, to nationalise the banks and the insurance companies. Well, I'd had that problem when I'd been Prime Minister. When I saw the National Executive passed a resolution, I dictated a letter myself to the insurance companies, a letter to myself, and sent to the insurance company, one of the insurance companies, to say, is this true? And I then wrote back and said, well, I prepared it at the time, I'm very surprised you should write me this letter, though I had drafted it, because obviously it's not going to be the policy of the government. I shouldn't take any notice of the National Executive. Then they were going to do merchant banks. Now, merchant banks are the holy of holies in our country and yours. I didn't dare send them a draft letter for them to use, because while the insurance companies are numerate but not entirely literate, the merchant banks are highly literate, and many of them numerate too. And, but they did take my draft as it was, And I said, no, a load of rubbish, we would never think of doing anything of this kind. And that was about as near as we ever got. But as I say, what we have found is that all our major industrial firms are owned by the pension funds. Now, what is the pension fund? It is every boy or girl who left school, well, if it's in my constituency, I say sadly they haven't got a job, but every boy and girl who leaves school starts work in industry. It is to provide them with a pension when they leave industry in the year 2028, 2030, 2032, whenever it is, with having some correspondence to their highest earnings, perhaps, if all goes well, corrected for inflation, any inflation over that period. And so these pension funds naturally amass an enormous amount of money. The money is paid in by the directors of the company, by the management of the company, and the money is rising, and they've got to invest it somewhere. It's running into thousands of millions of pounds now. In fact, they've found places to invest it. One of our railway company is investing in the Rue Royale in Paris, road development, not in Britain, and the Champs-Élysées. And others are investing in old pictures of the time of the masters, paying millions for them. They've been criticized, but they may go up in value just as much as anything else I can think of. And so we have these pension funds. Now, when my committee came across these pension funds, I wondered what was happening in America. I had a feeling you were ahead of us. So I wrote a letter to a very, very great friend of mine, Jack Javits, Senator Javits. I'm sorry he isn't back there now, but he is getting on a bit, even older than I am. And he sent me a 950-page book. You probably got it in the library. Many of you know it by heart. Probably a report by Congress, or a committee of Congress, on pension funds. And as I say, it is a fact now that in the United States, I would guess that more than 60% of the common shares, the common stock, in all the big American companies are owned by the pension funds, to that extent by the representatives of the workers and employers. Certainly in Britain, and although we're behind you, 60% of all our industries, of the common stock of our industry, is so